Salams and welcome to the second episode of our pioneering series, Empires, Converts and Community, connecting with Britain's Muslim heritage. My name is Tariq Hussain and I will be your host once again as we discuss influential and forgotten British Muslim personalities, important Muslim heritage spaces, as well as how we might connect with them today. All our episodes are set during that fascinating period between the end of the 19th century and the start of the 20th, when the world witnessed a gradual decline and abolition of two of history's largest empires, the British and the Ottomans. It also witnessed the start of two world wars, and in Britain, the establishment of its very first Muslim communities. Last week, we set the scene for the series with leading British Muslim expert, Professor Ansari, walking us through the British Islamic presence, reminding us that it goes all the way back to the 8th century when an Anglo-Saxon king minted his own coin with the Islamic Declaration of Faith on it, before bringing us through the centuries, encountering traders, diplomats, mystics, converts, and migrants to make clear that Britain's relationship with Islam and Muslims is a very long one. We also spoke to grassroots heritage practitioners and activists, Sadia Ahmed and Tanya Williams, who reminded us of the importance of archiving and making the British Muslim presence visible in our nation's narrative. We then used the example of the country's first ever self-guided Muslim heritage trails, a project that all four of us came together on, to show how that might be done. For those of you that missed this opening episode, as Mijan explained a little while ago, you can now watch the recording on the Everyday Muslim YouTube channel, which will eventually host all the recordings from this series. Today's episode, called Abdullah Quilliam, Britain's Shaykh Ul Islam, the Ottomans, local politics and trade unionism, will be very different as we go from the general to the very specific and focus on arguably the most fascinating early British convert of all, William Henry Quilliam, who following his conversion to Islam in 1887, founded Britain's first mosque, Muslim community, madrasa, and Islamic journal in Liverpool. Feats that earned Quilliam the title of Shaykh Ul Islam of the British Isles. Whilst much of this is now entering the popular domain, as our title suggests, today's episode will explore some of the lesser known activities and aspects of Quilliam's complex life. And to do this, I have with me self-confessed Quilliam enthusiast and community historian Yahya Birt, who also helped to curate this entire series, I should add. And also with us today is Dr. Matt Sharp of the University of Pennsylvania, an expert on Quilliam and the Ottomans. Thank you both for agreeing to be on the show today. Now, before we get stuck into this fascinating individual's life, let me just remind our viewers that at the end of the show, there will be an opportunity to ask our guests any questions you might have. So please do put them into the chat or ask your question directly via Zoom during the Q&A session. Okay then, let's start with Yahya. Given your passion for Quilliam, I'd like to begin by asking you why, in your opinion, Quilliam is so significant to the British Muslim narrative.
Well, I think that the fascination with Quilliam amongst generations of British Muslims who would never have met him, let alone his grandchildren, is testament to the fact that he is a lightning rod for different kinds of stories or narratives that British Muslims want to tell about themselves today. And because he is a complex figure with many local and international dimensions to his life, that we're still, even the historians who work on him are still trying to get their heads around. There are different aspects to him which can be taken up by people. Do you want to see him as a institution builder? Do you want to see him as a person who preached Islam and brought people to Islam? Do you want to see him as a political advocate? And so on. So he had different roles in society, religious and political and social roles. He also acted as an imam. So I think it's this flexibility in his life that enables people to, if you like, identify with one aspect or another of his story. Plus, I think, of course, in the Islamophobic present in which we live, British Muslims want to demonstrate that they have roots that go beyond go before the the kind of the traditional narrative of post-war migration to Britain.
So it's this kind of myriad nature to his life that you feel is what attracts so many different people to him. And so I guess it's a great way to then ask you about the area that we brought you on to speak about, because as well as being this great leader of the Muslim community of Britain, you've also discovered that Quilliam was very active in local politics and trade unionism. Tell us about that and why you think it is, again, another important aspect of his story.
Yes, thanks for that. Well, basically, Quilliam had a double career as a young man. So he trained as a solicitor, and he also became a journalist and in Liverpool as a young man in his 20s. And this connected him directly into the world of politics, okay, and made him deeply aware of social issues in the city. And so, in fact, the person who articled him was one of the early Tory mayors in the city, the first legal firm that he articled in the law under. But in the early 1880s, I found out that Quilliam, in fact, was active in the local Conservative Party in Liverpool. But I should add some context here, which is that in the early 1880s is in the run-up to the extension of the electoral franchise, and so a lot more of voting rights would be given to wealthier working class men for the first time in British history. We didn't get universal franchise in this country until well after the First World War. So the thing is that with that extension of the franchise, some Tories, particularly in Liverpool, wanted to appeal to the working class vote, and so a lot of young men sort of joined a kind of wing of the Tory party in Liverpool that were advocating for sort of more progressive policies, including a kind of limited trade unionism that was based on bargaining between, say, an appointed solicitor and business representatives, and they disparaged the use of strikes. So Quilliam basically was introduced into this world. Now, I mean, he even stood for as a local councillor to get a seat, but didn't get anywhere. That was in 1882. But then, of course, he became ill. He discovers Morocco. He discovers Islam, and sort of leaves his Tory party activism. But he doesn't sever his links with his Tory colleagues. The most important, perhaps, for him was a man called John Holding. Famous
to the slide. Sorry, Yahya. Should we put the slide
up? We should put the slide up. Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, Mijan, if you can put the slide up, please. It will be slide number 2.
Yeah, slide 2 would be good. So, slide 2, Mizan. Yeah, you just need to click on the second slide. That's fine.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, that's fine. I hope everybody can see that. Can everybody put a thumbs up if they're seeing that? Yeah, is there a thumbs up there? Okay, so this is John Holding. Now, John Holding was somebody who Quilliam was a mentor to Quilliam, 20 years older than him. He's most famous today, really, for having been the founder of Liverpool Football Club. But he similarly was a complex figure, working class, rural background, came to Liverpool, made his money in the drinks trade. Working class background, but a working class Tory, if you like, did well in business, and became a councillor in the 1880s, and arose to become Lord Mayor in the 1890s. But he also was a trade unionist, and he was the first president of the Carters Union. Now, the Carters were the ones who took the goods that were loaded off by the dockers and took them to the warehouses and the railway stations. And it was difficult, dangerous work, and they felt they needed a unionization. So Holding picked out Quilliam to be the solicitor for this new union, the Carters Union, established in 1889. So Quilliam was the first solicitor, Holding was the first president. And basically Quilliam represented the union at inquests, injury claims, and most importantly, he represented the union at these conciliation boards where he would negotiate terms with employers when there were wage disputes. So this was a kind of, if you like, Tory business unionism that was, they disparaged the use of strikes. They didn't want socialism or sort of a militant unionism, but they wanted a kind of a decent Toryism that would give workers a fair wage and would, but would not upset the expansion of business in the city and so on. So it was a kind of idea that labour and capital could have a kind of mutuality to them, and this sort of the sort of tagline I grew up with was that labour owed more to Methodism than to Marxism. Okay, but also this is actually equally a strong element in the story of trade unionism as well. So I think this early Carter's Union, it was a bit more like a mutual society. People paid their dues in, and from those dues they could get their injury claims, lost wages, funeral expenses, those kinds of things. It was more like a mutual society almost, and you also got a sort of protection, some protection for your job. So these weren't sort of militant. This wasn't a militant body, but it was one that protected the kind of at least some of the needs of the Carters. Quilliam later went on to become president of the Carters Union. So it succeeded John Holding in 1897. So if we can kind of bring up the next picture, please. Yeah, this is the banner of the union. Unity is strength, and you can see in the centre, you can see a typical horse-drawn cart of the Carters. So it was difficult and dangerous work, and this is why there was quite a lot of horrible injuries and even fatalities that happened. You can imagine that people could get crushed limbs and so on, and Quilliam had to deal with a lot of these cases. Now, if we can go over to the next slide now. You can go over to the next slide. That's it. So this is the only picture I could find. This is the year that Quilliam became president. So this is the Carters on their day off on Sunday morning in their Sunday best. Okay, and you can see one of them has brought his horse, and there's the banner that we saw earlier. So basically, in Quilliam's time, it was a modest union. There's about 3,000 at the beginning, and expanded to about 4,500 or so at his retirement. So it was, if you like, a union that went along with worked through the establishment. A lot of not only was it had a second Lord Mayor, Tory Lord Mayor of the city, and MP was on the board. Okay, it backed Tory candidates in the election. But again, these were sort of hybrid figures. So these were Tories who were trying to appeal to the new working class vote in the city. One thing I should say, that it was also sectarian at the beginning, at least in its membership. So it was almost heavily Protestant, and that was because of the people who ran the transport firms were Protestant businessmen, and they would only want to, if you like, employ their own. And although the union itself had strict rules against sectarian talking, its membership was largely Protestant. So what I should then go on to say is that Quilliam, stood down in 1908 before he went to, in March, a few months before he went to, he left Liverpool. So I'd like to go on really to say a little bit about the role that his second son played. We've got time to talk about that.
Yes, indeed. Carry on.
So his second son, Bilal Quilliam. If we can get up the next slide, please, Mizan. Okay, so circled here, you can see this is Bilal Quilliam, who died in 1965. Here he was part of the Liverpool Transport Strike Committee, and this is a major industrial action during a period of industrial unrest leading up to the First World War. Bilal, his second son, who he left in charge of the Liverpool Muslim Institute, became heavily involved in the same Carter's Union that his father had left. So he became a vice president and also solicited the same union. But what's the contrast between him and his father was that Bilal was involved in a period of mass unionization. So unions were gaining in strength. There was a lot more industrial action, and unions were combining together, and there was a use of the strike. And so his unionism represents a clear break with the conservative unionism of his father, and is much more familiar with the kind of, if you like, socialist or radical trade unionism that we may have been more familiar with. Any of us who grew up in the 1970s and 80s have been more familiar with that, with picketing and strikes and so on. And this strike was so huge that it brought the second port of empire to a standstill for three months. But it was successful. All the main demands of the strike was met. What was important also, it was sectarian. It crossed sectarian lines for the first time. So Catholic members joined the Carter's Union. Its membership exploded by 2000 in the year, and it became more of a mass organization. And so I think what's interesting here is you can see a big contrast between father and son in terms of what kind of trade unionists they were. And I think it's important in terms of understanding Quilliam is to understand how this plugged into his role as a religious leader. So I will end by saying that most of the members of the Liverpool Muslim Institute, the converts in his community, most of them were working class. I found evidence that a number of them were trade union members, and at least 2 of them were trade union officials. But during Quilliam's time in the Institute, he made sure that his version of trade unionism, a sort of a conservative business trade unionism, would be the predominant line taken by the Institute. I think his son, Bilal, wanted to push a kind of more radical view in the last year or so of the Institute, but it didn't get anywhere amongst the members of the Institute. But a couple of the members of the Institute did have quite distinguished careers as trade unionists in their own right.
Thank you for that, Yahya. And I think you've got one more picture that you wanted to share with us, just because I think it's one that you discovered recently. Do you just want to talk us through that?
Well, I'd just say that, just go to the next slide. It's not a great quality picture, but I just wanted to show the contrast here. So if you like, if Quilliam's mentor was John Holding, who was a Tory mayor of Liverpool, the first Lord Mayor of Liverpool and Tory politician, the man on the far right is Bilal Quilliam, and the man on the far left is Tom Mann, and Tom Mann is really the key figure in Britain in terms of a new radical trade unionism, a new urge towards organized strikes, called amalgamation of unions and so on. And Bilal actually became his legal advocate in court and defended him against charges of sedition, because the government sort of tried to throw the book at him, after this successful strike. So he was charged with sedition in Manchester in 1912, but that was thrown out. But Bilal was his legal counsel at that point. And the fact that Bilal is here being shown as with Mann as endorsing the candidates they put up in the city after the strike shows that he had become a respected figure within the trade union movement quite quickly, and he wasn't a marginal figure. It's the fact that Bilal's pictured here. So anyway, I just thought this is an interesting bit. If we have to embed these stories in the social history of the times, I think, to bring it to life.
No, fantastic. And I couldn't agree more. And I think Bilal's story is one that probably most people listening today would have known very little about. And of course, Bilal could only come to the fore because, as you pointed out, Abdullah Quilliam himself left the country. And when he did leave the country, if I remember correctly, he headed off to Turkey, which brings us nicely round to what hopefully Matt is now going to speak about. Now, Matt, you're going to take us from Quilliam's local dealings to his international ones with what was then the Muslim Caliphate, the Ottoman Empire. But before you do, tell us, what is an American from Iowa doing investigating the life of Abdullah Quilliam?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. This is, am I on mute?
No, we can hear you.
Good. Great. Yeah, I've never done anything like this, so this is new to me. But I first came across Quilliam when I was studying at the American University of Beirut. I was doing a master's in history there. And it's a long story how I got myself there from Iowa. But I was reading an American Protestant missionary named Henry Jessup, who wrote, among many titles, a memoir called 53 Years in Syria. And tucked within that 800-page, 2-volume book was a short excerpt on Quilliam and his American counterpart, Muhammad Alexander Russell Webb, who maybe some listeners know about. And I was fascinated by this American missionary's obsession with his competition in Liverpool and New York. So like many others who find themselves interested in Quilliam, I picked up Ranjit's biography, which had recently been published when I was back in Beirut. And reading this book from Beirut, I was drawn to the many accounts of Ottoman and Middle Eastern figures who traveled to Liverpool and visited Quilliam. And of course, the supposed connection between Quilliam and Abdulhamid II left me with so many more unanswered questions. However, as many people have noted, those accounts and much of the scholarship on Quilliam has relied heavily upon public-facing publications of the Liverpool Muslims like The Crescent and The Islamic World, or other English sources such as the British newspapers and journals, which we've learned a lot from, and scholars have done a great job of helping us to advance our knowledge about Quilliam and the Liverpool Muslims. But unfortunately, for those who may not know, we don't also have any major Quilliam archive, what you might call a Quilliam archive, meaning we don't have extensive personal notes and letters or diaries or personal materials and possessions that he had. So we can't really learn from those. We can only learn from the publications. And this is a shame, but it means people like myself, historians, we have to look to other sources and languages and places, which sometimes creates different perspectives and interpretations about who Quilliam was and what the Liverpool Muslims were like. And so at the same time that I was learning about Quilliam, I was taking a course with a noted Ottoman historian named Salim Dringo, who was completing his book on conversion and apostasy in the late Ottoman Empire. And his work mainly talks about converts and apostates within the Ottoman domains and how the Ottoman state dealt with converts and those who apostatized, who were Ottoman subjects. So I saw some overlap in the fact that I wanted to see what the Ottoman state felt about people that were converting to Islam outside of their domains, non-Ottoman subjects. So I began my study of Quilliam in Liverpool along with Webb, with the desire to highlight and elevate voices and perspectives of people residing in Ottoman Arab lands. And I started by asking a few simple questions like, if I were an average educated Muslim in Beirut, Cairo, or Istanbul, what, if anything, would I have known about Quilliam and the Liverpool Muslims? Which led me to read Arabic and Ottoman Turkish periodicals and journals and pamphlets to see if they were talking about these converts. And the other question I asked was, if I were an Ottoman official in Liverpool or London or Istanbul, what was the prevailing thought about Ottoman interactions with these converts? Why did they matter? Were they all in agreement? Were all Ottoman officials in agreement with the relevance of converts to the Ottoman diplomatic missions? And to do this, I needed to collect hundreds of Ottoman state archival documents written in French and Ottoman Turkish and English to determine if there was a specific Ottoman approach or policy toward Quilliam and the Liverpool Muslims. So in a sense, I wanted to flip the camera angle, as it were, to think about these individuals, their movements, and their Islamic activities as if I were looking at them from the Middle East, placing them within the history of the late Ottoman Empire in the Middle East. So I was asking what were the political, diplomatic, religious, and intellectual reasons for the entanglement between Ottoman officials and Muslim intellectuals with Quilliam and the Liverpool Muslims, and then also Webb in the United States.
Wow. That sounds like you had quite a bit to unpick there, Matt. And hopefully you're going to unpick some of it with us today, which is what makes this so exciting for us. Because, of course, much of what we're going to hear, none of us have heard before, unless we've gone and had the luxury of being able to read your PhD, which has just only been recently released as well, because, of course, you've only just recently completed it. So for those of us who are not aware, it was, in fact, the Ottomans who bestowed Quilliam with the title of Shaykh Ul Islam of the British Isles. Although I can see that Matt's taking a sharp intake of breath, so he's probably going to correct us. But this is the popular appropriation anyway. So can you tell us more about that and Quilliam's dealings with the Muslim Empire in general then, Matt?
Yeah, and when you pose that question in an email, I want to flip that question a little bit, and I'm not really going to talk about Quilliam's dealings with the Ottomans. I'm going to talk about the Ottomans' dealings with the Quilliam, and I think that needs to be said. That's the angle and the perspective I was trying to present, because I was basing it out of Ottoman documents. So, two of my longest chapters, as you said, related to these Ottoman documents. And for those that don't know, the relationship between the Ottoman state, Ottoman officials, and when we talk if I say Ottomans, I'm talking about Ottoman officials, people that are either in diplomatic positions or even in Istanbul. I'm not talking about Ottomans as just individual subjects or Turkish or otherwise. So that's what we mean by that. So the relationship spanned from 1889 to roughly 1908, although there are a few instances after 1908 that I could talk about at some other time. And two of the big takeaways that I came to this long relationship is, one, there were both allies and detractors among Ottoman officials, which means from my perspective, there was not a single monolithic consistent view of the potential benefits the Ottomans and the Ottoman state hoped to gain from Quilliam and the Liverpool Muslims. And number two, from roughly 1899 until 1908, I characterized that relationship to be more of a pragmatic partnership. So if I break those two kind of periods down, the period of allies and detractors, I think the best way to express this is to look at the dichotomy between two consecutive Ottoman consul generals. There was a consul general office or consulate office in Liverpool prior to Quilliam converting. So in the two people I'm thinking of are Ismail Lutfi Bey, who was the consul general from 1891 to 1893, and then the person that followed right behind him, Esad Kenan Bey, and 1893 until 1894. Now, both of these men were Muslim, but each eventually came to opposite conclusions about the values and merits of Quilliam and the Liverpool Muslims. So, for example, Lutfi Bey, he arrived in Liverpool shortly after Quilliam returned from his first trip to Istanbul in 1891, and immediately he found Quilliam and his son Robert Ahmed, who I think also was underrepresented in the literature. They found those two men, their behavior to be his suspect, and his first impressions were not favorable. He complained about how Quilliam bragged about his imperial gifts and the titles that his son received, and Lutfi Bey didn't believe that Ahmed received the title of Binbashi, which is like a major in the military. He called it a hoax and a pompous title. And he requested further information from the ambassador because he was sure that this was a false story that they were telling and wanted to gently correct the Quilliams privately. But he later wrote a lengthy report detailing the activities and makeup of the LMI, and eventually became a supporter of the LMI because he was there when they faced mobs of Liverpudlians who attacked the mosque and the worshippers in 1891 and 1892. So in a sign of Muslim solidarity and frustration with the British press's response, he wrote the ambassador, Rustam Pasha, asking for help to bring justice to the matter and repudiate the hypocrisy and double standard of those who in England who were defaming the Ottoman state's treatment of their Christian subjects, while at the same time they said nothing about English Christian treatment of their Muslim subjects in Liverpool. So Lutfi Bey looked favorably upon the idea that the LMI started the Liverpool Muslim College. He was present when Quilliam started the Crescent, the Islamic World, in his more secretive paper, The Liver. And it was Quilliam's communique about his plans for these periodicals that Lutfi Bey first learned Quilliam was ready, willing, and desiring to include favorable articles and news about the Ottoman Empire within his pamphlets and books and periodicals. Thus, in essence, Quilliam offered his paper as a propaganda tool for the Ottoman state. And during this period, as many scholars have noted, Ottoman diplomats in the foreign ministry engaged in what Dringel has called Ottoman image management and damage control, which is a major theme that runs through the Ottoman entanglements with Quilliam and Webb. There are examples in which the Ottoman state paid for editors, journalists, and politicians to either publish positive news or detract stories about Abdul Hamid and the Ottomans. But in the case of Quilliam, he offered this for free, a free service, without any provocation. By the time Lutfi Bey left in 1893, the Crescent praised his participation and assistance within the LMI, and no other consul general received the kind of accolades that Lutfi Bey was honored with, it would have appeared that the Ottoman relationship was going in a very positive direction in 1893. And so adding to that, Quilliam's trip to West Africa, which most people maybe know about in 1894, which was an actual errand for Abdul Hamid to represent him and the Ottoman state at the opening of a mosque in Lagos. And we know that it was Quilliam who suggested that Abdul Hamid honor the man most responsible for that mosque, Muhammad Shitta, who sponsored the mosque and actually asked Quilliam to intervene on his behalf. The next Consul General, Kenan Bey, gave Quilliam the imperial instructions for this errand, but we don't actually know the details of those instructions. And unfortunately, we don't know what Kenan Bey felt about Quilliam's trip or his return. But Yahya has found a newspaper article that shows that as soon as Quilliam returned in 1894 from his trip, it was the first time we read of the genesis of this title, the Shaykh Ul Islam of the British Isles, which was seemingly given to him at a meeting upon his arrival back to Liverpool and initiated by the LMI members themselves. And we can talk about that later if I'm sure people are going to want to talk about that.
I'm just aware, Matt, that we haven't seen any of your slides, maybe because you're in full flow. Do you want to put one or two of those up and just discuss them?
Yeah, after I get done with Kenan Bey and
Yep.
kind of the contrast, we can go ahead and go through those slides just so we can make sure we get through those. So in the final months of Kenan Bey's stint in Liverpool in 1895, he wrote several very lengthy reports about Quilliam and the LMI, none of which were very positive or supportive. I can't really go into a lot of detail about them, but needless to say, he accused Quilliam of bid'ah. He refused to attend meetings or prayers. And his general assessment was, and I'll quote here, "This institute does not make any progress in terms of propaganda. In terms of political advantages that some believe could be taken from it, I do not see any. Since instead of striking a conciliatory tone in order to dispel erroneous ideas Christians in general have of Islam, which I have often suggested to them, the members constantly attack Christianity and so feed the antipathy that pushes that religion away from ours. In addition, there are many reasons to not consider this enterprise as very serious." Again, there were allies and detractors. Kenan Bey was one of the strongest and most vocal detractors. He lumped Quilliam in with Webb, whom he believed was a charlatan. And however, like consul generals before and after, Kenan Bey had no power or authority to sever the relationship between Ottomans and Quilliam, nor was there a definitive Ottoman policy towards the Liverpool Muslims. I'm happy to go back and talk some about that, but let's make sure we get to these slides. So I think it's slide number 7. I don't know where we're at on the slides.
Mijambe, if we can have the slides up, please. I think it's the slide after the photo of Bilal.
Yeah, that's great. So this is the first.
That's the one.
Yeah, the first example of an Ottoman engagement with Quilliam, but it was actually Quilliam that initiated this first engagement. It was a letter sent to the ambassador Rustam Pasha in the 14th of November, 1889. It's a very simple letter with W.H. Quilliam solicitor stationery, letterhead. All it's doing is introducing himself as a solicitor and the president of the Congregation of the True Believers in Liverpool. He says that he's provided enclosed a pamphlet which was meant for the defense and propagation of Islam in the British Isles, which thus was the first edition of the Faith of Islam, although he didn't use the title. And it would be almost a year before Rustam Pasha even noticed or cared about Quilliam after this letter, and that was during the potential production of a play called Muhammad in 1890. And that's when Rustam Pasha and the other consul general at that time, took notice of Quilliam for the first time. So that brings us to slide number 8. Make sure we get to that one. Yep. So that's just an example of Consul General Dimitri Mavrocordato, who is a Greek Orthodox Christian. After Dimitri, there was a long stint of Muslim consul generals in Liverpool, but he was a Christian at the time. And you can see from this report is specifically talking about Quilliam and the Liverpool Muslims. It's in response to Rustam Pasha's request to start kind of a fact-finding mission about Quilliam and the LMI. It's pretty lengthy set of things. This particular one, he details what he believes are the goals of the LMI, which is to unite professing Muslims so that they can know and help each other, form a mosque for members of the association and seafarers, teach Turkish, Arabic, Persian, and Hindu, create a library, provide aid to the poor, spread the Muslim faith, conduct regular lectures on theology and Islam. He mentions that each member has to pay 5 shillings, and he claimed that there were 40 members in 1890, mostly he believes to be Indian, and about 10 English men and women. And he claimed that there were no Ottoman subjects who attended any of these meetings, and he didn't know about any Muslims meeting and congregating in Liverpool until he read about this situation in late 1890. So if we go to slide number 9, this is just an example of a Ottoman document. And this is Ibrahim Haki Bey, who wrote to some unknown Ottoman ministry office in Istanbul in May of 1891. It's one of 3 reports submitted by him, who was tasked as Quilliam's personal attendant during his trip to Istanbul in 1891. Other than Quilliam's brief later comments about his trip and Sir Woods Pasha's commentary in his memoir, this is the most complete firsthand commentary about Quilliam's trip to Istanbul. Among the things that he talks about, there's very little evidence that Quilliam actually stayed in the Yildiz Palace or any of the imperial palaces, which is usually claimed. Haki Bey said that he met and returned the Quilliams to a hotel. It's also possible that for a short stint he was in the palaces and then they moved them to a hotel. I don't know. But it doesn't seem that way. It seems like they just were in a hotel. There's absolutely no mention of his visit with Abdul Hamid. That doesn't mean that didn't happen. It just means that when he was with him, he doesn't mention or discuss what happened, how it went. He didn't observe anything. But Woods Pasha indicates in his memoir that they did in fact meet. Most of what Haki Bey describes was him taking the Quilliams to various mosques and palaces on different days as a personal guide. Before there was a Lonely Planet, I guess this is him. Haki Bey noted that Quilliam met and discussed Islam with Shotaro Onoda, a Japanese man who later converted to Islam, in part because of Quilliam's efforts. And Quilliam also met with a religious leader who encouraged him to speak about Islam in a discreet and cautious manner so as not to be offensive or disruptive in England. And so the last slide, next slide is coming up. Yes. This is just a simple example of Quilliam's Office of the Shaykh Ul Islam letterhead, stationery. I provided this image as it's the earliest example I have from the Ottoman documents of him using this particular stationery, and this is in 1902. Of course, Quilliam was using this title as early as 1895 in his publications, but there are thus far no examples between that time and 1902 that I have seen in which that particular stationery letterhead was used. Around 1895 and 96, I've seen stationery of him writing on the liver or the Islamic world as the letterhead, but not something like this. And this style of the Office of the Shaykh of Islam letterhead alters and changes a little bit. He adds things or changes the style a little bit. And I share these slides as a small sample of a much larger collection of documents, but they are in no way meant to tell the whole story or really much about the story concerning the Ottomans and Liverpool Muslims. And obviously, I think archival material, in many cases, Ottoman archival materials are important sources for a greater understanding and knowledge about Quilliams and the Liverpool Muslims. However, I'm a little leery of how some potentially might use archival material like this. For example, someone might come across 1 or 2 documents about Quilliam, Ottoman documents about Quilliam, and try to comment on them, overstating their relevance because they haven't examined and studied the trail of reports and communications that covered over 2 decades. So the conclusion someone might draw from 1 or 2 documents might not really express the historical reality, or might simply express the reality for one individual Ottoman official or one moment in time in a decades-long relationship, but they may not really represent the whole story, the whole narrative of what's going on. So I'm, I guess, trying to encourage people to avoid oversimplified conclusions that fit particular agendas or replicate how Quilliam himself represented himself and the relationship he claimed to have with the Ottoman state. It's a more complicated and messier story than Quilliam made things out to be.
Yes, and it clearly does sound like that. So just to try and unpick a little bit of it, from what you're suggesting, did Quilliam actually meet the Caliph himself from what you have looked into?
I don't see any evidence to the contrary.
Right.
The fact that Woods Pasha, in pretty extended detail, mentions it, being there at the time. And I think he gives some anecdote about Robert Ahmed, who was a young boy at the time, sitting on the lap of Abdul Hamid. So why would he make that up, I guess? I mean, that just seems silly. There are Ottoman Turkish newspaper articles that detail his visit and mention that he's going to the palace or mention that he's doing prayers. So that would indicate that there was, in fact, some meeting of some sort. Now, whether he was in just in the line of people, like sometimes that happened, whether he had a personal, secluded visit with him, I can't really detail. That's one of the examples of why archival materials, no matter whether they're Ottoman or not, they can reveal, but they can also obscure. So we need to be careful about the kind of conclusions that we make. And so I would say it's most likely. Now, the later trips that he took, that he says that he met with him, I don't know. I think one of the problems people have when they study the late Ottoman Empire and Abdul Hamid in particular, is we don't really have in Ottoman documents like a daily log of this is what Abdul Hamid did, this is who we met with, this is what they talked about. There wasn't a press briefing every day detailing the policies and procedures of the Ottoman Empire. So when people start talking about this is what Abdul Hamid thought, or this is what Abdul Hamid, this was his policy, there's no such thing. There wasn't a policy making thing apparatus in that sense. So yeah, that's I guess where I would go with it.
Wow, thank you for that fascinating glimpse, Matt. And it's quite apparent just from this discussion, just how difficult it is to talk about this vast and huge topic of his very complex relationship with the Ottomans. But I like the way you started off by pointing out that you've arrived at two conclusions, and that is that he clearly had allies there, but he clearly also had detractors, and mostly it was a pragmatic partnership after a certain period anyway. But thank you for that insight, and I'm sure it's something that will develop over time, and we'll learn more and more, hopefully. Now before we get to your questions, as with every episode, we want to try and show how this history and heritage might still be accessed and how viewers might connect with it. As it is Quilliam, the most obvious place to start will of course be the site of his former mosque in Liverpool, of which we do have some actual pictures. So this first one here, Mijamba, if you can put up the first image after Matt's documents. So that's after the series of documents for Matt. Yep, that one, that first image, yep. So this one here, next one. Yep, this one here shows the Sheikh leading what looks to be a very multi-ethnic congregation. Now, Brother Yahya, if I may, I came across this picture in one of your articles. So do you want to tell us a bit more about it and the building Quilliam used for the majority of the time as his mosque and education complex? I understand it is now a heritage space. Is that right? Sorry, is Brother Yahya on mute?
Sorry, yes. So not sure I caught all of your question, but yes, I mean, basically the when the mosque was, well, the institute was sold off. The mosque was just a small part of it. When the institute was sold off, it was 4 houses, 8 to 12 Brown Terrace on the West Derby Road. It eventually fell into the hands of the. I think it was sold to the local authority, if I remember correctly. And for many years, it was the Liverpool Records Office. And so, and also it was often where marriages would get registered, for instance. And there was a small annex at the back that the administrators called the mosque, but nobody quite knew why. So for years, it just kept records. Now, local Muslims in Liverpool came together in the late 90s, formed the Abdullah Quilliam Society, and eventually persuaded the council to give them the premises for £1 on the condition that they would restore it to its former glory, if you like, respecting its historical and architectural significance. So these are sort of late Georgian period houses, early Victorian, sorry, quite fine buildings, and it's been a big job for them since then to get it open. So they held it for 14 years, doing it up slowly until they were able to open it in 2014. Open the mosque, original mosque area. You can now go and pray in the mosque where Abdullah Quilliam and his community prayed and lectured, and they're hoping to expand and extend that. They've got the kitchen downstairs, some parts of the original kitchen where they cooked meals for the poor and the homeless in the city. So Quilliam would often feed the homeless of the city on Christmas Day, and would make a great sort of case for the largesse of Muslims over those Christians feasting and forgetting their fellow Christians who were going hungry. So he would make a great the kind of propaganda that some Ottoman officials wouldn't really like, according to what Matt has been telling us. So,
potentially. And if we look at the next picture, sorry, brother, I had to cut you. I just want to take you to the next picture, please, Mijambe, where, of course, this all marries up quite well. That picture on the left is a picture of the interior of the mosque. And I'm sure, brother Yahya, you'll be able to explain that there are a few items there that you wouldn't normally see in a mosque.
Yeah, well, you have to just to be clear that they're almost as if the camera's facing in 2 opposite directions, if that makes sense. So in a way, the modern pictures at one end towards the Qibla, the old pictures facing away from the Qibla, if that makes sense. So that would have been at the back. Mm-hmm. So the thing is, I think the mosque would be possibly through that doorway, and we're possibly looking at another room here. Mm-hmm. Because I mean, I'm unclear on this, and maybe some of the people, we've got some experts who are listening in as well, like Dr. Seddon, who might be able to tell us. But I'm not clear whether this old picture is either the back end of the original mosque or actually in another room. My reading of the Crescent seems to tell me that these were conducted in another room. So they would have some Sunday lectures, they would have sing-alongs where they would change the words of hymns. And this is a way of attracting the general public to come and provide adult education and then introduce the topic of Islam, at some point during the proceedings. It was kind of their outreach. But the mosque itself was used for, Friday prayers and the like, according to at least one book published in 1906 by the Muazzin of the mosque, Mr. A.C. Brown. That book it follows the Hanafi fiqh, as far as I can tell, in terms of wudu and prayer services. And clearly, at least Quilliam's claim in the Crescent was that they were always following the Hanafi fiqh when it came to how they conducted the prayers in the mosque. You have to also remember that they employed a number of imams from India in the 1890s. The most important was Muhammad Barakatullah, who was in his own right a very important pan-Islamist activist, who was the first president of independent India in exile, if you like. So before India was made independent, he was declared president in Afghanistan in the 1830s. He even met Nehru after Nehru. He even met with Nehru, who later would become the first elected president of India. But anyway, he was one of Quilliam's imams in the 1890s, and in fact was the one who proposed him for the title of Shaykh Ul Islam at a community meeting in September 1894.
How
as well.
fascinating. So just to come back to this picture, and for viewers, many of whom may not have seen it before, you're suggesting this could potentially be, the one on the left, could potentially be a room that was not used necessarily for the congregational salah.
I mean, I'm not entirely, I'll be honest, I'm not entirely clear which room it is, but I suspect it's not the mosque.
Yeah.
But if it was, it would be facing the other way. There is a kind of a sort of veranda and step on the other side, as it potentially could be.
Yes.
Yeah, but I can't say for certain.
Yeah, and of course, one of the things we do see there is on the right. Is that a piano or an organ there? I think.
I suspect it's an organ. It looks like an organ to me. Yeah.
And that, of course, is what was used, as you described on Christmas Day. When one of the examples when it was used, of course, when these hymns were appropriated and to be more Islamic.
Yeah, he would take famous hymns and change some of the words so that they would become, Islamic, but they would also already be familiar to people because they would have grown up with these hymns. So it was a strategy of preaching, I guess, or cultural adhesion, for people. So
it was about working with the familiar, and even on many occasions you hear the mosque being described as a Muslim church or something, just to help people who would have no idea about the religion, the faith, or the buildings to relate, right?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things needs to be done with this community is to kind of pay attention to what kind of language they were using. How are they translating key terms? I mean, one of the ones that's really struck me is my work on trade unionism and Quilliam's sort of militant pan-Islamist sort of stances that he took. A famous speech of his from 1896 where he describes ummah. He translates ummah as fraternal union. Now, I mean, that immediately recalls to me the trade union. It immediately recalls to me also the Freemason. The Freemasons Lodge. Quilliam was also a Freemason, among other things, although a kind of a member of a fringe Freemasonry that was open to other religions and was more liberal rather than the mainstream Freemasonry movements. But nonetheless, this idea of association, of fraternity, of association, these were ever presence of late Victorian society. Civic society was everywhere. And Quilliam is drawing on that experience to translate the concept of ummah. Now, I mean, I find that fascinating, personally, that, we all, in our own time and place, reinterpret these ideas. And I think Quilliam is no different.
Yes, and clearly he's, as you say, he's doing it in the context of the time. Now, Mijamba, if I can take you to the next slide, this next picture is just to show you what the building looks like from the outside today. So, Brother Yahya, if somebody was to turn up there today, what might they expect, and what can they access, not access, so to speak?
Well, it's much better than it was, so that you can now arrange to get taken around some parts of the building with the Abdullah Quilliam Society, but it's still a work in progress. They're yet to establish the museum. They've yet to do up the kitchen, but they have got a functional prayer space, and they've also got wudu facilities. They've also, the top floor has been turned into privately rented flats for students to create income for the society and to sustain it going forward. They've also just putting in a bid for the building next door. You can't quite see it, but the red brick, you can see the red brick building. Now, that was the West Derby Union. And of course, it's significant that John Holding, who we talked about at the beginning, John Holding, the Quilliam's trade unionist ally, Tory politician, Lord Mayor, he visited the mosque. He was the first civic official to visit a mosque in British history. So he visited the mosque and talked about religious tolerance in 1898. And Quilliam gave him, actually, 2 years earlier, had arranged for a medal, Order of the Imtiaz, to be given to Holding on the orders of Yildiz Palace. So we have reporting on that. So there is a connection between the founder of Liverpool FC and the Caliphate. which I find fascinating. And so the building next door, the red brick, you can just see is the West Derby Union, which was Holding worked with for 30 years, and it provided philanthropy, hospitals, and other good works throughout the whole city under the old poor laws. And so the AQS have also want to acquire this building and are fundraising for it right now, or were during last Ramadan.
And just because I can anticipate this being a question, the Abdullah Quilliam Society has absolutely nothing to do with the Quilliam Foundation. Just to make that clear right now, because I know that.
No, they're both, if you like, products of the fascination with this man, if you like. Although they've gone in very different directions. But it has been a difficulty for the Abdullah Quilliam Society in terms of fundraising. So they've continually had to bat away the accusation that they're associated with the think tank in London. And so it's sometimes made their life a bit difficult, but I think that they're slowly and surely turning that corner. I don't think they should give up on the name Quilliam. I think we should be owned in all of its complexity, if you like.
Indeed. And maybe that's a discussion, a whole discussion for another day, taking ownership of that particular name, given what's happened. Finally, in this last slide, Brother Mijam, a reminder that Quilliam's grave remains a mystery. Those of you that tuned in last week will recall when we showed the map of the Muslim cemetery walk, right in the top right-hand corner there, we made the point that, of course, although the great Sheikh was buried in what was then the Mohammedan cemetery in Brookwood, Surrey, the whereabouts of his grave remain a mystery. So that's just two examples of tangible ways in which it's still possible for people to connect with Abdullah Quilliam, the former Shaykh Ul Islam of Britain. Okay, now I can see some questions coming in. So we're going to go over to those. And the first one here from Reardon, and it is, okay, so let's see. Do you have any information from the Ottoman archives? So clearly, Matt, this is for you. About Quilliam's title of Alim and an ijaza bestowed upon him at the Fez Kairouan University. And it follows on with, is there evidence that he received some form of Islamic training there, Matt? Yeah, can somebody unmute Matt, please?
Okay. So, I believe this would have been during Lutfi Bey's time, and I do know that they were taking notice of his trip to Fez. He was supposedly also bringing with him a sword from a Arab Muslim Moroccan in Manchester, he was supposed to try to give this sword as a gift to the emir. So he was sent, in addition to whatever else he was doing in Morocco, for the second time. And according to Lutfi Bey's report, that had nothing to do with what the British newspapers or anyone else was saying, Quilliam never delivered that Fez and was not even allowed into the walls of Fez. So what he did in Morocco, based off of Ottoman records, are unclear. But according to Lutfi Bey, now this is just what he said, where he got this information, I don't know if it's firsthand from Quilliam or from things that he was hearing. He never actually entered into the walls and met the emir or did what he said he did. And there's no indication that he was given a title. He didn't notice that or make mention of it during that time. And if I remember correctly, this trip was right at either before or right at the beginning of the publications of the Crescent. So that's all I can tell you. There isn't any clear indication that from the Ottoman, but that's another thing, that there's things that in the Ottoman archives that you would hope that were there that aren't there, and things that you would not expect to appear. So that's just, you're left with what's there, not what you want.
And just to help contextualize it, in the broader kind of discussion with all the stuff that you've offered us for the first time today, Matt, would you say this particular individual, Ottoman individual, is an ally or a detractor?
He eventually becomes an ally. At the very beginning, he was a detractor. His first impressions were negative, but by the end, he's praised, and the Crescent praises him, and he becomes a strong ally of the Muslim community and Quilliam.
Thank you. And so, in other words, just to answer that question, there is no evidence to confirm or really deny this.
Nothing to confirm, but like I said, if you were to say that his report is true, that Quilliam never actually made it into the city, that he was not allowed into the city, then I'm not really sure how he got the ijaza and the title of an alim. And it was honorary at best anyways.
Indeed. Okay, now we've got a question here from Catherine, which I feel like we've addressed already. Sadly, a lot of the time when you talk about Abdullah Quilliam, the Quilliam Foundation is the first association. I wonder why they chose his name, which I feel like Yahya's alluded to already. And if you think any of their works reflect Quilliam, I'm going to let you take that one, Yahya. Does any of their work reflect Quilliam? Can somebody unmute Yahya, please? Sorry, start again, please, Yahya.
I mean, I don't know if I don't think that's an academic question. I think that's a kind of a question for our community as a whole to debate and decide how we think that, how we come to understand our own history, our own heritage, how much and what kind of stories we want to make out of it, or how realistic we want to be, and whether we want to play games with it. And that responsibility is on all of us. Do we kind of treat history as a kind of putty, subjective putty that we bend into any shape we want it to be because it suits our purposes at the moment? Or do we want to take some kind of take it seriously and take some kind of lesson or some kind of instruction from it? And I think that's the moral here. I think that's all I'm going to say.
Yeah, very well sidestepped there, Yahya, I must say. Fantastic.
I don't feel any need to add to the barrage of debate that's been on this issue.
Indeed. In your, okay, what about, has this impeded the wider awareness of Quilliam? And again, I think you clearly said that the Abdullah Quilliam Society, who is working with the building, with his original building and with his original memory, it's clearly impeded them, right?
It's impeded them from fundraising, but I think that indirectly the Quilliam Foundation may have helped publicize Abdullah Quilliam. It's if you like, its very notoriety may have, in a strange way, have publicized
indeed
Quilliam's name.
Yeah.
Credit where it's due and all of that. I'm not sure that was their aim, but I think that as again, it's also important that we don't just see Quilliam. We just read Quilliam as somebody who would have been the biggest enemy of the Quilliam Foundation. So we just turn his story into a bit of modern day polemics. I think we have to look at his time, his community, his contribution more seriously than that.
Mm-hmm. But I agree with you. Inadvertently, they certainly raised awareness about Quilliam's name. Without a shadow of a doubt, there's the old saying in journalism: all news is good news. And so, it certainly helped to raise more awareness, and people are more aware of the name. Right, I'm just going to scroll through and try and find where I was, because the questions are flying in now. This one is definitely from Matt, and it's from Reardon again. The Crescent tells us that John Yarka, the famous fringe Freemason and member of the Order of the Zuzamites, received the military medal of the Imtiaz. What is the connection between Yarka, who wasn't a Muslim, and the Ottomans, Matt?
Oh.
Sounds like you've been put on the spot there a little bit.
Yeah, I don't know. I think as Yahya was pointing out, it's possible. Again, there isn't any details about Quilliam presenting names or suggestions to people that are deserving of medals. nor have I ever seen local Liverpool officials or Ottoman officials in Liverpool or London suggesting names for. So how these names got brought to the attention of the Yildiz Palace or Abdul Hamid is something unclear, which is part of the problem. Is even if you can find the Ottoman document in which it tells you so and so from such and such a city is bestowed this particular medal, sometimes it doesn't even give an explanation of why.
Yeah.
So, for example, for the Muhammad Shitta, it does say, if you see that document, it does say that it's because of his efforts and the things that he's doing for Islam. But the few examples of Abdullah Quilliam or his son Robert Ahmed getting medals or honors, it doesn't always indicate what it's for, like because of X, Y, and Z efforts or honorary behavior or nothing like that. It just says this is what has been bestowed upon them. So it's unclear sometimes. I hope that answers the question.
Well, it certainly tells us that it's unclear, Matt. Thanks for that. So we have we have one from Lynn here. So there's two parts to this question. What was the British government attitude to Quilliam is the first one. And then was his visit to Lagos supported by them? Now, if I remember correctly from what Matt was saying, that happened once he'd left Britain. But I'll let Yahya, if you can answer the first part. What was the British government attitude to Quilliam as far as you understand it?
I mean, I don't think there's any strong evidence that he was anywhere on their radar at all. The only kind of challenge to that was the work of Jamie Gillam has pointed out, which is that when there was a chance of him being appointed to a consulate, I believe the Ottoman consulate or the Persian Ottoman consulate in 1906, it did come to the attention of the Foreign Office, and they recommended against him being awarded it. They thought that he wouldn't use it honestly. That was their assessment. But other than that, there's no strong evidence that he was anywhere really on the radar. Sometimes, the London, very, very occasionally, the London press would, whichever of his campaigns got national attention, sometimes they would run, slightly negative stories about him in the London press. But whether the Foreign Office or anybody else really cared about that, I can't see any evidence that they cared about any of what he was doing in Liverpool.
Yes, and just that second part, I don't know if you're able to answer it, Matt. You certainly spoke about the Lagos visit. Was his visit supported by the Brits? Do you know? I mean, it sounds like from what Yahya's saying, they probably didn't care.
So this was in 1894. It definitely appeared in the British press.
Oh, okay.
But I never saw anything that indicated that it appeared in the British press. It appeared in English imperial presses from West Africa. So that was known. Whether the government paid any attention is unclear. Throughout his time, the Home and Foreign Office did comment about marriages that were Islamic marriages.
Oh, yeah.
Early in the stage, and then that's how the 1906 incident occurred, is because Bilal actually performed a marriage while Abdullah was out of town, but it came back that Abdullah might have done it or whatever. And so it was this whole issue about both that caused issues with the Ottoman government, between the Ottoman government and the British government for Abdullah and Robert Ahmed, because Robert Ahmed was a civil servant official in the Ottoman consulate, but apparently the British government never received notification that was going to happen. And so they were very upset.
Which probably brings us nicely on to the next question. Why did he leave England in 1908? This is from Auntie Batul. And how did he justify the new identity when he was confronted? That's the first half of her question. So I'll let you have a go at that, Matt, before I go into the second series of questions that my auntie Batul has sent over very kindly. So there you go.
Okay, so the Crescent story is that he was being lambasted by the wicked Christians in England for his propaganda, and so he had to leave. And he was called upon by the Caliph for a visit, and his son was expecting, Robert Ahmed was expecting a new post in the Ottoman government. So, and that was what was reported in the Crescent. But we know from everyone else's wonderful scholarship that it was in fact his legal malpractice of forging what is the word? Yahya can fill this in for
Decree
me too.
Nicae, decree absolute.
Yes.
Yeah, with grounds for divorce, concocting grounds for divorce. Yeah.
It was a forged statement, basically.
Yeah.
And so that caused him legal issues, legal problems, to the point where he lost he was taken from the bar. And so that's what initiated his leave. Now, why did Robert Ahmed leave with him? That is a question I've yet to really understand or answer, because he had a post at the Liverpool consulate. So why he needed to leave with his father in 1908 is unclear to me.
Do you have any more about why he changed his identity? Either yourself or Yahya. Why did he change his identity was the second half of the question.
This is more Yahya's project than mine, so he does a lot more with this.
I don't know for certain. I have some theories, but I don't feel there's anything definitive. But I don't believe that one thing that was said when he passed away, and he said it a number of times before he died, but his daughter also said it was that it was to benefit from being a beneficiary in a will. Okay, but I don't believe that, to be honest with you. I find that story hard to believe.
Just to make that clear, he changed his name so he could benefit from someone else's will.
Yeah, to be a beneficiary in a will.
Okay.
But I don't believe that story, just because for many reasons I don't want to go into, but because it would take too long. And also I think it's just a theory at the moment. I have a theory, but I don't think it's right to speculate. I'm working on it. So watch this space, I think.
Great. Well, we'll come back to you on that. Now, this is again potentially going into speculative territory, and I know how much you academics hate that, but you're here and you're going to have to answer the question. Okay. So what was happening in his absence is probably something easy to address, but why did he not revive the Liverpool mission on his return? Matt first, and then Yahya.
So I have yet to see any evidence that he traveled back to Liverpool, and if he did, he would have traveled back in some form of disgrace or shame, because he was, as Yahya has pointed out, he was a very prominent lawyer, a solicitor. And that's, I think, my take is that's what made him successful in starting the foundation in the first place, the institution in the first place, is that he had name recognition and had lots of connections in Liverpool, a strong community presence prior to converting. And so he was able to build upon that. And I think because of how he had to leave, returning back would have been, this again, speculation, returning back would have been a very fool's errand to try to keep things going. That's my take.
Well, I'm really quite proud of how much I'm getting you lot to speculate here. So Yahya, is that the reason the fall from grace was so big, so to speak, that it would have been impossible to go back there and try and do anything because of pure shame? Is that?
I mean, his old friends were divided, so it was an open secret. They all knew he was Quilliam, so he had a circle of close friends, Muslim and non-Muslim, who protected him. Went along with the new identity, So, for instance, one was an old friend of his who was an old journalist from his old journalist days in Liverpool, and there's a letter from him to somebody else. After Quilliam was outed as the Leon identity was blown apart at a reception on Douglas in the Isle of Man in 1919. And the identity was blown apart. And basically in this letter, his old friend said, look, he paid the price as a solicitor, he was struck off, that was enough. I don't mind. He's a decent enough fellow. I don't mind the fact that he was going around with another identity, but I did tell him not to take risks because most people wouldn't be understanding. So you had a small group around of people who were tolerated it. And I think he did go back to Liverpool to visit his family and so on. But he went back as Leon occasionally in the 1910s under the Learned Society that he set up. But he didn't make a big splash anywhere because he was recognized on a number of occasions by people who were hostile towards him, going around under another name. And there's evidence, I think, that when he was discovered in 1919, his society collapsed a little bit. The support he had building up society over about 6 or 7 years, the support collapsed after that exposure in 1919. So, but he always chafed against it. He always wrote poems and articles in his later journal that he set up, the Philomath. He wrote some of them as Quilliam. He wrote some of them as Leon. He signed some of his book reviews as the Sheikh. He wrote on religious themes, but he said they were translations from Turkish poets. So he wanted to continue with his religious identity. I mean, he was chafing at the fact that he couldn't present himself as Abdullah Quilliam, I think that you can see that frustration of him, nudge, nudge, wink, wink between the lines. You're kind of half of who I am, but I'm not really. So I think that he was always, in a way, wanting to be found out as well. It's a bit difficult to unravel because, as Matt said, we don't have his personal papers. We're reading between the lines of his publications and public knowledge about him and press reports. And this is very difficult material to use to unpack psychological or internal questions. You can't do that. The kind of questions that people are asking us, the material just doesn't really very easily yield answers to those things that aren't speculative.
Indeed, trying to understand someone's intent is very difficult.
Exactly. Yeah.
So this question is again from Lynn. Was Quilliam more influenced by Sunni or by Shia Muslim? Now, given what you've looked at, Matt, in the Ottoman archives, who obviously the Ottomans were Sunni, is there any suggestion that he dabbled with Shiaism at all?
Within Ottoman documents, no. Everyone commented that he was following a Sunni path, and also Ottoman pamphlets and periodicals when they talked about him, or even in Arabic journals and periodicals and pamphlets when they make mention of him, they all talk about him as a Sunni of some stripe, or that he's advancing the Sunni religion, and particularly the Hanafi. So, yeah, that's as far as, the actual fiqh, that would be up to someone that's more trained in those things to make comment on them.
I think if I could cut in here,
yes.
I think that the really fascinating work is still yet to be done, and Matt will know more about this than me possibly, but I think that Quilliam made a kind of civilizational argument for Islam, a kind of civilizational, if you like, polemics / apologetics. That Islam actually was a civilization equal to Western civilization. And so I think this was in an era of imperialism, in an era of ideas of kind of racial and cultural and civilizational superiority. His sort of civilizational arguments for Islam were quite novel, and they were picked up by some of the ulama in Egypt and also in Istanbul. So his arguments from his early pamphlet, The Faith of Islam, and this is what Matt has written about. But I think it's important to say that I think his dawah, if you like, to the working class men and women of Liverpool in translation was picked up as a reformist discourse in places like Egypt and Turkey. And that's why I think it's quite fascinating. More work needs to be done on the substance of his argument. But I think that they could see some use in the way that he argued for Islam in a novel way that resonated with other reformist discourses that were in Egypt and Turkey and Iran at the time, because his books were translated into Urdu, we see Urdu, Farsi, and Arabic, and possibly other languages. But we've managed to get hold of documents in those other languages that were translations of his works.
Right. So, of course, as you pointed out earlier, Yahya, he did state that they were following the Hanafi madhab of Sunnism, but when, like in other early mosque examples, like with the one we've seen in Woking, there was no real overt sectarianism, and it seemed to have quite an inclusive approach in that, you know, leaders and notables from various communities, including the Shia community, were often welcomed. Did we see that with Quilliam's mosque as well?
Yeah, I mean, the whole age itself was an age of rising anti-imperialism. So it was an age of unity amongst Muslims. Generally, Muslims were emphasizing the fact that they needed to progress in the world. It was more an argument with the West, about modernism and whether Islam could be modern and could be relevant in the world. That was the kind of the axis of debate, and the kind of like bloody sectarianism that we have lived with in recent decades in the Muslim world and in the diaspora. You know, it wasn't. That wasn't the spirit, the zeitgeist. It wasn't the spirit of the times. The spirit of the times was a kind of cosmopolitan, non-sectarian, pan-Islamist, you know, a language of sort of solidarity that certainly, like certain leaders like Abdul Hamid, were very keen on cultivating, to be honest with you. Not all Muslim, you know, this is before nationalism. Of course, there were elements of nationalism in the ascendancy too, but there's a kind of a battle between a kind of nationalist kind of language and a kind of pan-Islamist language. And Quilliam definitely was more comfortable with the pan-Islamist sort of language, even though I say that he was also, I think, of interest to the Egyptian reformers like Abdur and Rashid Rida. Actually wrote a review of one of his books, you know, of the faith of Islam, and he liked it. He said it was a very useful book, although it had some errors.
We need to close up.
Sorry?
We got only about a minute left now.
Oh, we've only got about a minute left. Gosh, and I've realised that there were so many questions. So I do apologise. A quick one then. How do you think, this is from Gareth, how do you think the current Turkish government views Quilliam, Matt?
So for those that may know, he's appeared in one of their more popular Turkish soap opera journal, Payatat Abdülhamid, the one about Abdülhamid, and it obviously plays fast and loose with the history, but it shows that there is a fascination with him. Lots of journals, popular history journals as well, have published some stories about him, or he shows up, pictures and images show up in Turkish newspapers and online, just as they are in the Arab world, but more so in the Ottoman or in the Turkish Republic. So yeah, there is just like there is in the UK, there's a new fascination, and they're also trying to grapple with how to adopt and adapt him for their own purposes.
Indeed. Did you want to add anything to that, Yahya, before I wrap it up?
No. I feel that we should have heard more from Matt rather than from me.
Okay. Yes, I can imagine why. Thank you all for your questions. And please don't forget to join us for our third episode at the same time next week, when we will have 3 experts discussing London's early Muslim activists, Victorian Muslim dissenters, including Marmaduke Pickthall and the largely unknown and fascinating figure of Dous Muhammad Ali. To register for that, it is the same process as it was for this episode. Thank you all again for joining us. And thank you again to our guests, Yahya Birt and Dr. Matt Sharp. It has been truly an education. We hope you all have a great evening. Goodbye and salams.